His lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words, just 5, and the color drained from Arthur's face so fast I thought he might actually faint right there on the mahogany conference table. The accounts are already empty. Arthur's hands, usually so steady, began to shake. The gold fountain pen he'd used to sign thousands of contracts that built his ego and destroyed his rivals, clattered to the floor. He looked at me, his eyes searching for the submissive, quiet woman he'd been married to for 20 years. But that woman was gone. For the first time since our honeymoon, I didn't look away. I didn't offer a comforting smile. I just leaned back, crossed my legs, and watched the monster realize he was trapped in a cage of his own making. But to understand the end, you have to understand the beginning. You have to understand how a girl with nothing became the shadow that pulled the strings of a multi-million-dollar empire without anyone ever noticing. My name is Eleanor Vance. At least, it was. To the world, I was the graceful Mrs. Vance, the woman who hosted the charity galas, who picked out the perfect silk ties for her husband, and who stood 2 steps behind him at every ribbon-cutting ceremony. I was the silent partner, and Arthur, he was the face, the loud, arrogant, self-made visionary who loved the sound of his own voice almost as much as he loved the feeling of power. I met Arthur when I was 22. I was working as a junior bookkeeper for a construction firm he was trying to acquire. Back then, he didn't have the private jets or the custom-made suits. He just had ambition, the kind that burns everything in its path. He saw me not as a partner, but as an asset. I was good with numbers. I was organized. And most importantly to him, I was sweet. He thought my silence was a lack of character. He didn't realize that in the world of business, the person who speaks the least usually knows the most. We got married within 6 months. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a merger. He needed a stable home life to look respectable to investors, and I was young and I believed his lies about building a legacy together. "It's our empire, Ellie," he used to say, while I spent 18 hours a day fixing his chaotic ledgers and navigating the tax codes he was too impatient to understand. By our 5th year, the legacy was thriving. Arthur was the king of real estate in the tri-state area. He was featured on magazine covers. He was the man everyone wanted to be. And me, I was the woman who made sure the bills were paid and the skeletons stayed in the closet. I managed the payroll, the offshore filings, the vendor contracts. I was the nervous system of Vance International. Arthur was just the loudmouth at the top. The shift started slowly. Success does something to a man like Arthur. It makes him think he's invincible. He started coming home later. The smell of expensive perfume that wasn't mine began to cling to his jackets. He stopped asking for my advice on deals. He started making impulsive investments without checking the cash flow. But the real turning point was the gala for our 15th anniversary. I had spent months planning it. 300 guests, the finest catering, a string quartet. I was wearing a dress that cost more than my father's first house. I walked into Arthur's office to tell him the car was ready, and I saw it. He was on the phone, laughing, a real, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in years. "Don't worry, baby," he whispered into the receiver. "The old guard is retiring soon. Once the merger goes through, I'll have enough liquid capital to buy that place in the Hamptons. Just you and me. No more pretending." The old guard. That was me. I didn't storm in, I didn't scream. I went to that gala, I shook hands, I smiled for the photographers, and I even toasted to another 15 years of prosperity. But inside, the girl who loved Arthur Vance had died. In her place was the senior auditor who knew exactly where every cent of his money was hidden. The next morning, while Arthur was nursing a hangover, I opened my laptop. I didn't look for divorce lawyers, not yet. First, I looked for the money. Arthur thought he was clever. He had set up a series of shell companies, Blue Marble Holdings, Apex Development, to move personal funds around. He thought he was hiding his love nest expenses from me. What he forgot was that I was the one who filed the articles of incorporation for those companies. I knew the passwords. I knew the bank managers. I knew the loopholes. I found out he had been seeing a woman named Isabella for 3 years. She was a consultant on his payroll, earning a salary that rivaled his vice president's. He'd bought her an apartment, a car, and apparently he was planning to use the upcoming merger with the Sterling Group to cash out and leave me with a standard prenuptial settlement. The prenup. Ah, yes, Arthur was very proud of that document. It stated that in the event of a divorce, I would receive a flat sum of $2 million and the house in Connecticut. To Arthur, $2 million was a tip. To him, he was winning the divorce before it even started. He didn't realize that a prenup only protects what's there. I spent the next 3 years, yes, 3 years, being the most devoted, unsuspecting wife in history. I encouraged his affair. I would accidentally suggest weekend trips for him to clear his head, knowing exactly where he was going. I pushed him to take more risks. I convinced him that he didn't need to consult the board on the newer acquisitions. "You're the visionary, Arthur," I told him over dinner. "They're just bureaucrats. Trust your gut." And he did. He became reckless. He started moving larger and larger sums into Apex Development, the shell company he thought was his secret escape hatch. What he didn't know was that I had spent those 3 years slowly, quietly, diverting the ownership of Apex. Through a series of complex sub-agreements and clerical errors in the filings that he signed without reading, the majority shareholder of Apex Development wasn't Arthur Vance. It was a trust fund registered in the Cayman Islands, a trust fund belonging to my sister's daughter, with me as the sole trustee. Arthur was effectively stealing from our joint marital assets and depositing the money directly into a vault he didn't even own. He was building my retirement fund, thinking it was his getaway tar. But I didn't stop at the money. Money is just paper. I wanted to dismantle his dignity. I decided it was time to meet Isabella, not as the scorned wife, but as a friend. I tracked her to a high-end Pilates studio she frequented, the one Arthur was paying for. I didn't show up in my designer suits. I wore simple leggings, a baseball cap, and used my maiden name. Within 2 weeks, we were grabbing green juices after class. Isabella was exactly what I expected. Beautiful, ambitious, and incredibly insecure. She saw Arthur as her golden ticket, but she lived in constant fear that he would never actually leave me. "My boyfriend," she told me one day, her voice hushed, "he's very powerful, but he says his wife is unstable. He says he's only staying until the big merger is done because he's afraid she'll ruin the deal if he leaves now." I sat there, nodding sympathetically, sipping my juice. Unstable. That was the narrative Arthur was building. He was telling his friends, his partners, and his mistress that I was losing my mind. It was a classic move, the crazy wife defense. It makes the divorce easier for the public to swallow. "Oh, poor thing," I said, patting her hand. "But if he's that powerful, shouldn't he be protecting you more? I heard that in those big mergers, the lawyers look at everything. If they find out he's spending company money on you, they might cancel the whole deal. He wouldn't want that, would he? I planted the seed of doubt, and Isabella, being greedy and frightened, began to pressure him. She started demanding that he put the new apartment in her name immediately. She started showing up at his office unannounced. She became the very thing Arthur hated most, an inconvenience. Meanwhile, back at the Vance estate, I was playing the role of the fading flower perfectly. I started forgetting things. I'd leave the stove on, or I'd ask Arthur the same question 3 times in an hour. I wanted him to believe his own lie. I wanted him to think I was becoming a ghost in my own home. "Ellie, maybe you should see a specialist," he said one evening, hiding a smirk behind his wineglass. "Maybe you're right, Arthur," I whispered, looking vacant. "I just feel so confused lately. I'm so glad I have you to handle the business. I don't know what I'd do if I had to read those complicated papers myself." That was the green light he was waiting for. 2 days later, he brought home a stack of documents. He told me they were medical power of attorney forms, just in case I got worse. In reality, they were waivers that gave him total control over my remaining personal shares in the company. I signed them, but I didn't use my normal signature. For years, I had been practicing a slightly altered version of my handwriting. To the untrained eye, it looked like mine. To a forensic document examiner, the kind I had already put on a secret retainer, it was a clear forgery. I was giving him enough rope to hang himself, and he was tying the noose with a smile. While Arthur was busy managing my mental health and dealing with an increasingly hysterical Isabella, I turned my attention to the board of directors. Arthur's biggest rival on the board was a man named Julian Vane. Julian was old school, rigid, and he hated Arthur's flashy lifestyle. I invited Martha's wife to tea. Martha was the town's primary gossip, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. "Martha, I'm so worried," I told her, letting a single tear fall. "Arthur is working so hard on this Sterling merger. He's spending so much time with that marketing consultant, Isabella. He says she's essential for the brand, but he's been buying her so many gifts. I just hope the investors don't think he's using company funds. It would be a scandal, wouldn't it?" I didn't have to say anything else. Within 48 hours, the rumors were tearing through the upper echelons of the city. The Sterling Group, a conservative firm that valued family integrity, began to ask questions. They requested a pre-merger internal audit. Arthur panicked. He needed to hide the trail of money he'd been spending on Isabella. He did exactly what I knew he would. He moved the consulting fees and the apartment costs into the Apex development accounts. He thought he was burying the evidence in his secret vault. He was actually putting the evidence into my vault. The day of the internal audit arrived. Arthur was sweating, but he was confident. He'd scrubbed the main books. He'd reorganized the marketing budget. He thought he was safe. He didn't know that I had sent an anonymous tip to the auditors, a detailed map of the offshore shell companies, including the passwords he thought only he knew. I remember that night vividly. Arthur came home late, his face ashen. "The auditors found some irregularities," he muttered, pouring himself a double scotch. "Oh, Arthur, how terrible," I said, standing by the window. "Is it serious?" "It's a mistake, Ellie, just some paperwork confusion with Apex. I'll fix it. I just need to move some things around tomorrow. I need to dissolve Apex and move the assets back to the main firm to show it was all legitimate investment." "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said, watching his reflection in the dark glass. "You always do." But he couldn't fix it, because the next morning when he tried to log into the Apex accounts to move the money back, he found the message that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Access denied. Suits stepped out from the kitchen. My security team, hired with the first few thousand I'd siphoned off a year ago. "Don't," I said, my voice cold as a winter grave. "You've already lost, Arthur. If you touch me, the police get the files on your creative tax filings before lunch. If you sit down and listen, maybe you'll survive the day." He called the bank in a rage. They told him that the majority shareholder had authorized a freeze on all transfers pending a legal review. "Who is the shareholder?" he screamed into the phone. "I am the owner of Apex." "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," the banker replied coolly, "but the records show the owner is the EV Heritage Trust, and the sole trustee is Eleanor Vance." Arthur dropped the phone. He looked across the breakfast table at me. I was calmly spreading marmalade on a piece of toast. "Ellie?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What is the EV Heritage Trust?" I looked up, my eyes clear, the confusion of the past few months gone like a morning mist. "It stands for Eleanor's Victory, Arthur, and it holds exactly $19 million, all the money you thought you were hiding for your new life with Isabella. It's not yours anymore. It never really was." That was the moment the mask finally broke. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He lunged for me. But he didn't get far. Two men in darks, he sat. He had no choice. "Here is what's going to happen," I said, sliding a new set of papers across the table. "This is a revised divorce settlement. You are going to sign over the main house, the vacation properties, and your remaining shares in Vance International. In exchange, I won't send the evidence of your embezzlement to the Sterling Group or the IRS." "You're leaving me with nothing," he hissed. "No, Arthur, I'm leaving you with your freedom, for now. But there's one more thing." I smiled, and it felt wonderful. "Isabella called me this morning. She thinks I'm your unstable wife, remember? She was so upset that you hadn't moved the apartment into her name yet, so I told her the truth. I told her you were broke. I told her you'd been using her as a pawn to hide money from me." I leaned in closer, smelling the fear on him. "She's currently at the police station, Arthur. She's giving them a statement about how you forced her to help you with your financial schemes in exchange for her salary. She's protecting herself, just like I taught her." Arthur didn't sign the papers that morning. He was too arrogant for that. He thought he could still outmaneuver me. He thought he could find a loophole, a lawyer meaner than mine, or a way to discredit me. He spent the next month burning through his remaining cash, the money I'd purposefully left in his personal account just so he would have enough to pay for a losing battle. He hired Harold Whitfield, a shark of a lawyer, who charged $1,000 an hour. I, on the other hand, had Nina. Nina wasn't a shark. She was a ghost. She didn't have a skyscraper office or a famous name. She was an expert in forensic accounting and international tax law. While Arthur and Harold were preparing for a war of character, Nina and I were preparing a war of math. The day of the final hearing arrived, courtroom 4B. Arthur showed up looking like the king he still thought he was. He was wearing his charcoal Armani, the one that screamed success. He even had the audacity to wink at me when he walked past my table. Beside him sat Harold, looking confident. In the gallery, I saw Julian Vane and the other board members. They were there to see the crazy Mrs. Vance get her tiny settlement and disappear. Judge Patricia Holden took the bench. She was a woman who had seen everything, and she had no patience for theatrics. "Mercer versus Mercer," she announced. "I understand we are here to finalize the division of assets. Mr. Whitfield, you have the floor." Harold stood up, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, my client, Arthur Vance, has been incredibly generous. Despite the unfortunate mental state of his wife over the past year, he is willing to honor the original prenuptial agreement of $2 million. He is also willing to let her keep the Connecticut house, provided she vacates within 30 days. We believe this is more than fair, given that Mrs. Vance had had no involvement in the growth of Vance International. I felt Nina stiffen beside me, but I kept my face like stone. "Mrs. Vance," the judge asked, looking at me, "do you have a response?" I didn't stand up. Nina did. "Your Honor," Nina said, her voice calm and clear, "we reject the proposal, not because we want more of Mr. Vance's assets, but because there are no assets left to divide." A murmur went through the gallery. Arthur let out a short, mocking laugh. "Mr. Vance," the judge warned, "silence." Nina continued, "We have submitted an addendum to the court, document 14B. It is a full liability disclosure statement. You see, while Mr. Vance was busy managing the firm, he was also the sole signatory for a series of high-risk loans taken out by the Apex Development, a company he claimed to own entirely. Those loans were secured against his personal shares in Vance International and his primary residences." Harold Whitfield frowned. He leaned over to Arthur. "What is she talking about?" Arthur shrugged, looking annoyed. "It's nothing, just some bridge loans. The assets in Apex cover them 10 times over." "Actually, they don't," Nina said, directed at Harold. "Because 3 weeks ago, the EV Heritage Trust, the legal owner of the Apex assets, divested all its holdings. The cash was moved to a charitable foundation for domestic abuse survivors. The assets are gone, but the liabilities, the debts, those stayed with the signatory, those stayed with Arthur." That was the moment. Harold Whitfield opened the thick folder Nina had handed him. I watched his eyes scan the pages. I watched him do the mental math that I had spent 3 years perfecting. His face went from tan to gray. He looked at the numbers, then at the signatures, then at the total at the bottom of the page. He leaned in and whispered those 5 words to Arthur. "The accounts are already empty." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Arthur didn't move. He didn't breathe. "What?" Arthur croaked. "That's impossible. I signed those. She signed." "You signed a waiver, Mr. Vance," the judge said, reviewing the documents. "A waiver declining an independent audit. You also signed personal guarantees for $19 million in debt to various offshore creditors, debts that are now due." Arthur turned to me. His face was twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You bitch! You set me up! You stole my company!" "I didn't steal anything, Arthur. I just did exactly what you taught me. I looked out for myself. I was the silent partner, remember? You handled the vision. I handled the reality. And the reality is, you're broke." The judge's gavel came down like a thunderclap. "Mr. Vance, sit down. Another word and I will hold you in contempt." But Arthur couldn't sit down. His world was collapsing. The board members in the gallery were already on their phones, likely calling emergency meetings to strip him of his title before the news hit the press. Julian Vane looked at me and gave a slow, respectful nod. He knew a predator when he saw one. The divorce was finalized an hour later. I walked out of that courtroom a free woman. In the hallway, I saw Isabella. She was waiting by the elevators. She looked tired, her porcelain skin sallow under the fluorescent lights. When she saw me, she stepped forward. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is he really gone? The money?" "The money was never his, Isabella," I said, stopping in front of her. "It was the company's. It was mine. It was a ghost. I hope you kept the jewelry he bought you. It's probably the only thing the debt collectors won't take." I walked past her, the sound of my heels echoing on the marble floor. The aftermath was exactly as I had planned. Arthur tried to sue me for fraud, but every document had his signature, every transfer had his thumbprint. He had been so eager to hide money from me that he had hidden it from himself. Within 6 months, Vance International was sold to the Sterling Group for pennies on the dollar. Arthur was left with a mountain of debt and a reputation that was radioactive. Last I heard, he was living in a small studio apartment in a part of town he used to call the gutter. He spends his days calling old friends who won't pick up the phone. And me? I didn't move to a villa in Italy, not yet. I bought a small, quiet house by the coast. I painted the kitchen sage green. I opened my own firm, Vance Consulting. We specialize in asset protection for women who find themselves in marriages with men who think they're too smart to be caught. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit on my porch and look at the ocean. I think about the girl who once believed in Arthur Vance. I feel sorry for her sometimes. She was so kind, so patient, so willing to be second. But then I take a sip of my coffee, black, no cream, and I look at my bank balance. Being the old guard wasn't so bad after all, because the thing about being a silent partner is that you're the only one who knows exactly when to stop being silent. And when you finally speak, everyone listens. Thanks for watching to the end. I'm sure you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe to the channel. Click on the next video mine on your screen. You'll definitely like it. Bye-bye.